With Dragons of Autumn Twilight, we now enter into a stage of our class where we need to place our ideas about fantasy and play into the context of a broader social phenomenon, that of fandom. Nothing about this novel, nor the Dragonlance Chronicles series to which it belongs, fits into our usual conceptions of literature or literary production. But as we'll see, that's not so much because there's anything wrong with the novel. Rather, we need to re-examine what our assumptions about literature, narrative, and reading really are. To begin with, if we look at the literary canon, even with genre literature like fantasy, sci-fi, and horror, co-authored works are quite rare. And the process by which Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman came to create Dragons of Autumn Twilight is itself very unique. Margaret Weis was a graduate of the University of Missouri Creative Writing Program in 1970. Her career before meeting Tracy Hickman might best be described as workmanlike, a great example of what a typical creative writing major from a solid but low-key Midwestern program might expect to get to in their professional lives. She got a job, first in advertising, then in editing, with the religiously affiliated Herald Publishing House in her native Missouri. While there, she wrote manuscripts for numerous historical and educational books aimed at the K-12 market. In 1983, she applied for a job as a game editor with TSR Incorporated, the publishers of Dungeons & Dragons. But Weis had no experience with role-playing games at that point, and, worse still, the only fantasy work she had ever read was the Lord of the Rings trilogy, so she did not get the job. And this is where our discussion of fantasy and play comes into contact with the concept of fandom. All speculative fiction, and here I'm including adventure, mystery, horror, sci-fi, and fantasy, had always had immersive qualities, which meant that readers of that fiction wanted to act out or embody their favorite narratives. 6 years before Margaret Weis got turned down for that game editor job, a phenomenon simply known as Star Wars had demonstrated the economic impact of the desire for immersion. When a text combines narrative archetypes and the possibility of escape from the mundane, with the potential for play and simulation, it creates almost unlimited potential for marketing to fans of that text. The success of Star Wars would lead to something that is now ubiquitous in modern life: multimedia or cross-platform marketing. That idea was still relatively new in 1983, but TSR was keen to take advantage of its potential, so they had created a new book division to create more traditional paperback fantasies that would evoke the world of Dungeons & Dragons and possibly draw new players to the game. TSR saw potential in Margaret Weis's background in children's publishing, and so she was hired to work on a new project in the book division alongside one of TSR's game designers. Like Margaret Weis, Tracy Hickman had been an English major in college at Brigham Young University. He had never really distinguished himself as a writer of traditional fiction, and so spent his years after graduation knocking around in different jobs. However, during that period in his life, Laura, his wife, introduced him to Dungeons & Dragons, and it turned out that both Tracy and Laura Hickman had a talent for game design. They developed 2 adventures for Dungeons & Dragons, Rahasya and Pharaoh, that were so impressive that the couple were hired on by TSR to make more adventure scenarios. It was Tracy Hickman who was paired with Margaret Weis to work on a project to create a set of novels which themselves would be based on published role-playing adventures. I linger over this publishing history of Dragons of Autumn Twilight because it explains so many of the qualities of the novel and the trilogy as a whole. Dragons of Autumn Twilight was a runaway success for TSR, selling over 4 million copies and landing on numerous bestsellers lists. Arguably, this success came about because it combines the best qualities of both creators. Hickman contributed many of the fantasy and gaming conventions with which Weis was unfamiliar. A world-transforming cataclysm that would create the conditions of adventure for characters. A cast of villainous monsters who provided the obstacles. And of course, the idea of a party of companions who would face those challenges together with friendship and devotion. Tanis Half-Elven, Sturm Brightblade, Caramon and Racelyn Majer, Flint Fireforge, Tasselhoff Burrfoot, Goldmoon, and Riverwind. But it was Weis's professional skill with prose that would enliven the world of Krynn and bring convincing reality to the archetypal characters that Hickman had helped create. emphasizing not just their relationships with each other, but also their emotional and often romantic investment with the people around them. Dragons of Autumn Twilight feels a little bit like an immersive fantasy quest and a little bit like a young adult drama, and it's that combination of elements that has been the primary reason for its success. This oscillation between the ludic demands of the game setting and the narrative demands of literary craft is consistent throughout the novel. The adventuring party has to form at an inn, as it would in any role-playing adventure, but Weiss's literary instinct was to have the novel begin in medias res. The majority of the companions have already known each other for years, but are now reconnecting after a long time apart. As the readers get to learn about the characters in the party, Weiss leans into her literary background to make the journey of discovery both interesting and credible. A short moment from early on in the novel can stand in for numerous similar encounters throughout. Here, the Knight of Solamnia, Sturm Brightblade, is responding to the tribeswoman Goldmoon's assertion that her companion of the Keshu people, Riverwind, mistrusts the party. Quote, "And what of you, lady?" Sturm asked. "Why do you trust us? Don't you have these same prejudices?" Goldmoon turned to face him. He could see her eyes, dark and shimmering as the lake behind her. "When I was a girl," she said in her deep, low voice, "I was a princess of my people. I was a priestess. They worshipped me as a goddess. I believed in it. I adored it. Then something happened." She fell silent, her eyes filled with memories. "What? What was that?" Sturm prompted softly. "I fell in love with a shepherd," Goldmoon answered, looking at Riverwind. She sighed and walked toward the boat. Sturm watched Riverwind wade into the water to drag the boat closer to shore as Raistlin and Caramon reached the water's edge. Raistlin clutched his robes around him, shivering. "I can't get my feet wet," he whispered hoarsely. Caramon did not reply. He simply put his huge arms around his brother, lifted him as easily as he would have lifted a child, and set Raistlin in the boat. End quote. In a very short space, the reader learns about Sturm's thoughtful compassion, as well as Goldmoon's forbidden love for the shepherd Riverwind. That's a storyline that Weiss would have been familiar with from countless works of canonical English literature, from Shakespeare all the way to Thomas Hardy. And here she puts it to good use, creating an additional layer of dramatic tension. Even as readers must wonder if the main characters will survive the goblins and cultists from whom they are fleeing in this moment. Now they'll want to see how and if Goldmoon and Riverwind will realize their love for each other. But the scene doesn't end there. We also get to learn about two of the most beloved characters in the Dragonlance saga, Caramon and Raistlin Majere. In some ways, they are reminiscent of a narrative archetype, the big guy and the little guy, that we've already been introduced to through the works of Fritz Leiber. But they also participate in the modern archetypes of the jock Caramon and the wizardly nerd Raistlin. We can't quite be sure in the scene if Raistlin can't get wet because he's physically timid, or, what seems more likely, that his exploration of dark magic has started to transform him physically, rather like one of the ring-wraiths from The Lord of the Rings, making this one of many, many in-text references to the work of Tolkien. So, Margaret Weiss's craft with dialogue and willingness to drop in literary references made Dragons of Autumn Twilight a successful work of fiction. But it can't be denied that Tracy and Laura Hickman's adventure plot and setting are the field in which Weiss's narrative operates. Weiss herself was first a player in the Dragonlance adventures that Hickman was dungeon master for, and there are many times throughout the series when we can feel that game-based origin of the narrative. One such moment, and one of my personal favorites, comes halfway through the novel as the heroes are using an old gully dwarf cauldron lift, basically a huge dumbwaiter, to descend into the dead city of Xachtzaroth. Surrounded by their dwarven allies, the party members are slowly and individually realizing that they're going to have to fight through a large group of monstrous draconians in order to continue their mission. The scene begins with the fearless Caramon leaping down into one of the cauldrons. Quote, "That big idiot," Sturm swore. Shoving gully dwarves aside, to look down, he saw swinging fists and flashing armor as Caramon and the Draconians flailed away at each other. Caramon's added weight caused the pot to fall faster. "They'll cut the lummox to jerky down there," Sturm muttered. "I'm going after him," yelled Tannis. Launching himself into the air, he grabbed hold of the chain and slid right down it into the pot. "Now we've lost both of them," Tannis groaned. "Flint, come with me. Riverwind, stay up here with Raceland and Goldmoon. See if you can reverse that damned wheel." "No, Taz, not you!" Too late. The Kender, screaming, enthusiastically leaped into the chain and began shinnying down. Tannis and Flint jumped into the hole too. Tannis wrapped his arms and leg around the chain, hanging on just above the Kender, but the dwarf missed his hold, landing in the pot, helmet first. End quote. Anyone who's ever played Dungeons & Dragons and is familiar with combat, and particularly the impact of turn order and initiative, will recognize what lies behind this scene. The players who are controlling Sturm and Tannis would recognize the peril of this situation and reason that their characters, experienced and thoughtful adventurers, would want to devise a plan of attack. But there was no chance for this, as the players controlling Caramon and Tasselhoff, no doubt with gleeful laughter, decided to take their enemies head-on. Mixed into all of this is Flint's headlong plunge into the cauldron, representing, no doubt, a failed die roll. It's a great action scene that manages to develop the characters a little bit more, even as it calls back to the gaming origins of the narrative. So the co-contributors, Weiss and Hickman, and their two sources of narrative inspiration, play and literature, managed to work in this text in ways that they didn't always in other publications and works. It wasn't perfect even here, to be sure, but Dragons of Autumn Twilight represents one of the best instances of the marriage of fantasy and play in traditional print storytelling. As the novel nears its climax, we get to see that marriage played out in very short order, indeed, in a single page. It comes at the dramatic moment in which Goldmoon is resurrected by the power of the once-lost goddess Mishakal. It begins with Tannis's heartfelt and strangely modern cry of existential anguish. Quote, "I cannot believe in you," Tannis cried. "What kind of gods are you, that you demand a human sacrifice? You are the same gods who brought the cataclysm down on man. All right, so you're powerful. Now leave us alone. We don't need you." End quote. In trying to express Tannis's sense of tragic disillusionment at the apparent death of Goldmoon, Weiss leans back into her knowledge of canonical literature, and in so doing creates an expression of doubt that echoes some of Andre Norton's commentaries on modernity. Near the end of a century that had seen unprecedented violence and disaster, Tannis's cry about the gods who brought the cataclysm down on man may well have had special significance for many readers. But this is escapist fantasy, very much in the tradition of Tolkien, and so the tragic disillusionment does not last. Goldmoon reappears, magically, at the foot of the statue to which Tannis cried. Quote, "I am a true cleric now," Goldmoon said softly. "I am a disciple of Mishakal, and though I have much to learn, I have the power of my faith. Above all else, I am a healer. I bring the gift of healing back into the land." Reaching out her hand, Goldmoon touched Tannis on the forehead, whispering a prayer to Mishakal. The half-elf felt peace and strength flow through his body, cleansing his spirit and healing his wounds. "We've got a cleric now," Flint said, "and that'll come in handy." End quote. This passage carries on in the highly overdetermined literary language that Weiss had established at the beginning, but it very quickly moves into the language of play and simulation. Taken in the context of the role-playing scenario for Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Goldmoon's assertion that she brings healing back into the land is a simple statement about the magical spell options now available to characters. This reading of the line is reinforced by Flint's immediate assertion that having a cleric will come in handy, a comment whose practical tone is utterly misplaced until we put it in the context of the game, where, of course, having healing magic really is a necessity. So Dragons of Autumn Twilight helped to establish a pattern that we now take for granted, one that sits at the intersection of fantasy and play, fandom, and commercialism. Competent, literate storytelling is combined with narrative archetypes from the culture within a system of simulation and play, a system which in turn creates the conditions for acts of storytelling by the reader-consumers themselves. In the years immediately following the release of Dragons of Autumn Twilight, TSR would become a victim of its own success. The explosive popularity of the game, fueled now by books, cartoons, and video games, would lead to a cultural backlash in the form of the Satanic Panic. Moreover, inexperienced in the large-scale world of cross-platform marketing, the company would ultimately spread itself too thin, leading to a financial decline that would mean selling Dungeons & Dragons to the upstart gaming company Wizards of the Coast in 1997. But the publication of Dragons of Autumn Twilight nevertheless marks an important turning point, when the genre of fantasy would transition from being the marginalized realm of dreamers, outsiders, and misfits to becoming one of the central creative spaces of Western capitalist culture.